older, William Church or Henry Fairchild?
Henry Fairfield. Henry Fairfield is he.
Fairfield.
Yeah, it's okay. No, he's the older. He was the, and I think primogeniture held out in his case. He was the older. There was William Church. I think there were a couple of children that didn't survive, but I think of it. I think of if I was creating a kind of a pyramid, I'd have William Henry Osborne, and that name gets used again. But in the beginning, it was William Henry Osborne. He had two sons, Henry Fairfield and William Church, and then there's just kind of two.
Ready? Stand by.
Lloyd, just before you go.
Oh.
Yep, and we have lots more. So if you're, as I said, the real historians of the if it's the Osborne family that we really want to nail down, then my wife and Chip and Douglas and Fred and Katie are the group to talk to.
How is Katie? Is she has regained her health?
I think so. Oh yeah, I believe so, Sonia. Thank you for asking. I think she's, yeah, and it's kind of scary time, but I think she's okay. Plays tennis, and I think she's doing fine.
Great. Okay, we're rolling.
Okay, so talk about how you were here as a young man, and then left and came back, and then how you met your wife and so.
Great. Well, let me. How should I say? When I was here and growing up, particularly in the summertime, the focal point of our activities was the Highlands Country Club, which continues to be right where it always was. And I believe that if you dig back far enough, you'll find that the Highlands Country Club originally was a place that the Osbornes sort of figured they needed a place for their children to play golf and tennis and things like that. So I think it was Osborne inspired in the beginning. And now it's owned by the Open Space Institute. But when we were growing up, when we were as teenagers, we couldn't play enough golf and tennis and swim, and it was the focal point for all of our activities. And a number of my childhood friends who still live here, and that was one of the beauties of coming back here, that I made a lot of new friends when I came back, but there were a number of people who continued to be here, Dean Anderson and Chris Galligan and John Benjamin and Polly Townsend, I know her as Polly Townsend, and a number of the boys from Cold Spring are around. In those days, Garrison and Cold Spring were beginning to come together. One of the big differences between my time coming back to Phillipstown and then Garrison and Cold Spring, there was perhaps more. They weren't as fully integrated, because if you kind of think of the origins of the town, the Garrison, they were the railroad guys building the houses in Garrison, and there was a support industry that came to help them with that process, and a lot of those people lived in Cold Spring. So bringing the two towns together has been a lifelong process, but I feel as though it's come a long ways. But in addition to Highlands Country Club, we were all in the Little League, so there was a Garrison team in the Phillipstown Little League. The other teams were all from Cold Spring, but there wasn't a rec department at that point. The rec department was one of those great things that's happened since I've been away. The town, with some help from some landowners who have provided the property, has developed a wonderful recreation activity for the town and has contributed to a real feeling of unity between Garrison and Cold Spring. And while, of course, the school districts are still separate, it feels a much closer community now than it did when I was growing up. So I had wonderful summers and vacations here, and we had a wonderful combination of friends who lived here and went to school here locally, and some others whose parents sent them away to school. So there was this combination of my friends were both local, or were all local, but some of them went to school right here and were year round, and others went off to school. It was a good combination. And our friends came from both Cold Spring and Garrison, and the activities of the day really were, until we got into our later teens, we spent a lot of time at the Highlands Country Club. We played baseball down on the diamond here, and we played up in the Little League, and they were just great summers because we swam and sometimes swam in the lake as well as the pool over at the club, and we had a really good group. We got around on bikes for the most part. I mean, from time to time our parents needed to drive us someplace, but we stayed here and we just had wonderful times.
Did you horseback ride?
I didn't, but there was a lot of that. I'm trying to think about amongst my friends. You know, that wasn't so much what my friends wanted to do. I mean, there's a good bit of it going on, but perhaps not like Maryland and New Jersey and some places that really did have there was no hunt tradition. There was no fox hunting horseback ride. There was some, but it wasn't a big activity for us.
What about for women? Was it something that the young women continued to do, or
I'm trying to think of my sister and her friends, and I don't recall a lot of horseback riding. I'm sure some did it and were dedicated, but it just didn't strike me as a big activity. But by the time I got to college and left, I wasn't here all the time. I moved into the city of New York and worked there for a while, and came eventually to marry Anita Rhett. And what was wonderful about Anita, she happens to be a really terrific person, but her mother and father were great buddies of my mother and father. So they knew Garrison, they knew the Highlands Country Club and the castle, and by the time Anita and I got married, it was. I had actually been married for a short time before then, but it wasn't until I met Anita that I met the true love of my life. So when we decided to come back here 5 years ago, we went off and lived in Baltimore together and lived in Philadelphia. But when the idea came up and it certainly wasn't planned to return to Garrison, but when we found out that the Burkes were thinking about doing something else, their children had grown, Anita was very quick to say, gosh, I remember all those stories. And my mother and her mother were really great buddies. And my mother-in-law spent some time in the summers up at the castle with the professor. I mean, there was a lot of history. So that by the time we thought about moving here, Anita was she said, well, this is right. I'm not sure she probably got more than she bargained for, because Garrison had changed a lot by the time we got back here. I mean, I often think that it had the difference between the 50s and 60s and when we got back here in the late 90s, or at least a portion of it was. I mean, I think people. They weren't quite as. I remember the 50s and 60s as being a simple time, a period when it was pretty straightforward what you did. We didn't really have very many in the way of. I mean, all the people who live here now, the artists, the actors, the designers, the people who work at home, the sort of broadening of professional activity. In the 50s and 60s, you were a banker or a lawyer, and all the dads commuted. All the dads kind of hated it. All the dads drank too much, but everybody went to bed pretty early because they were all. I mean, they weren't the raucous school board meetings. I don't think people felt had such strong feelings then, because I think they were going a little bit more by the book. I mean, this was the way it was done. And there were a number of, as I said, a number of old families who were still here, and the sons of those families and daughters I came to know, and they were my childhood friends. It was really very different coming back, although the town itself had been remarkably well preserved. And I quickly figured, gee, now I'm now part of this. I was just taking everything for granted pretty good when I was, good for nothing. It just wasn't. I sort of think of myself as a youth and don't remember being very interested in anything other than myself. but I feel now that it's pretty important to keep this thing going. So the notion that our house would stay in the family for some time to come, and that one of my children would come to live there, and that Phillipstown would be the same really special place to live. I'm now sort of thinking, as a landowner, I should probably do my part, which I think led me to think that maybe running for office was the right thing. And I've done some things. I've tried to help. I've done some volunteer things for the town itself, and I mean, everybody else has too. It's just that kind of a town. People are active, and they want to preserve what they've got. I sometimes think that we've gotten a little far over towards the preservationist side, and we need to be open to some useful, smart, attractive kind of commercial activities. But it's a wonderful town, and I think it can continue to be. I mean, the pressures around us from Dutchess County and Westchester will just get more intense. But we have topography on our side. You know, it's rocky and hilly, and it's hard to build. You know, it's hard to build. We have a couple of laws. We have I think, a pretty enlightened town board who are overworked and have no real executive branch, but they do a pretty good job. I think it's a wonderful town. I'd like to work hard to keep it that way.
What about your kids? How many children?
I have 3 children. They are 22, a daughter called Annabelle, who's recently completed college and come back, and she's living with us now and has a job in the city. I suspect she'll go off and live in the city or live with her friends. She'll get tired of living with us. We have a son, Michael, who's 20. He's a junior in college. He goes to Brown University, and he's spending his junior year abroad in the town of Bologna. So he's going to be in Italy all year. And then we have a 17-year-old son who went to the Garrison School and did like his father and grandfather and uncle, got shipped off to this school up New Hampshire that he still's at. So there's some of those traditions. I mean, I guess I'm like my family. You know, some of the things I've done are like what my family did. Here I am living in their house, but the community is such an interesting community, and so much more diversified. I mean, you couldn't find any artists. And gosh, my father, we have artists in town. I mean, it was very straight. It was very straight laced in those days. It's just a really nice community, I think. And I'd like, without making too much of this, I think I'm here now, and I want to be part of the group that helps it stay the same way.
Very good, very good. Well, and certainly the Osborne family and the Prentice family and the various, related extended family has done an enormous amount for the area.
The Osborne family, particularly the Osborne family history, is a good history. I mean, it really is. I mean, I'm sure there were some profits to be had as a result of some of particularly the real estate deal. But I think
I understood that a lot more land has been given away than developed and sold.
Oh, I think so. I think the record is very. This is a good group doing the right thing, and I feel good about that. And the members of the family that I'm aware of, they're all different, but they all feel pretty strongly that there's something that's been going on here for a while, and that they kind of need to be part of it. Fred feels that way, I'm sure, and Katie I know does, and does lots of things to back that up. She's very active in good things, and so I think it's a good family. But there are a number of them. I mean, the Benjamin family has its own history, and that's a great family. Polly Townsend's family is a great family. There are lots of. I mean, for the Osbornes, for their history, there's a lot of other good, interesting families in Garrison whose history are as interesting, I think. And I think the influence of those families has been good for this town.
Well, we were in Ecuador, and the guy was saying they didn't have any noblesse oblige here, and it was not a pretty picture, where the people who in fact were more comfortable seemed to just steal everything they could get their hands on, and that was it. And there was no sense of, a duty.
Yeah, Mike, I think that's right. And I go a little easy because that term noblesse oblige, sometimes, I mean, to me, there are some connotations that go with it that aren't altogether attractive.
Yeah, it's the sort of Jane Austen condescension.
Yeah, it's the, well, of course, we're the Osborns and you're everybody else.
Condescension was part of the whole. It was expected, and it was ingrained during that time period.
Yes.
So when you bring it to a later time period where you don't have that, it has.
Yeah, I was terribly. I mean, I go very, very easy. I mean, and my mother. I follow my mother's example on this. I mean, you'd have never known. I mean, if there once was a prominent family that she was a part of, you'd have never really known that. I mean, that wasn't her. I mean, she was all the positive aspects of noblesse oblige. I mean, I think she felt a duty, but she delivered it in a I'm pretty much like you sort of a way. And there wasn't a sense of, well, it's funny. The history of the family is all over the map on that front. There are probably some who take themselves a little more seriously than others.
Yeah, well, I think what you're describing is that she truly was a kind person.
She was a kind person.
Yeah, and that, cuts through everything.
Yeah, I think, Sonia, just right. Thank you for saying that. I think that's an excellent description. And it wasn't all great. I mean, I'm sure she had, in some respects, had a childhood that was, there were probably aspects of it that were pretty lonely. I mean, her father, she saw quite a lot of her grandfather. She didn't see that much of her father, who got married again. So it wasn't all gravy. And I'm sure things were tough in the 30s. I have a feeling they just didn't have any money.
Listen, I'm old enough I remember the 30s.
Oh,
we were
yeah.
born in
I don't think they had any money. I really don't think they had any money, and that probably put a lot of pressure on them because they were probably trying to keep up. They were trying to probably be the Osborns, but they didn't have any. I mean, people come down kind of hard sometimes on my uncle about, well, he lost the castle. I don't really see it that way because I don't think he had much help. And I'm sure there wasn't any, nobody gave him, keeping up the castle. I mean, he came to him, whether it was a good deal or not, I don't know. So I don't really blame him for anything he may have done. I'm sad that that somebody hasn't fallen into good hands.
We'd heard that he was also trying to head off a really bad housing development.
Well, that he was when in the development of the North Redoubt Club. That whole Bill Brown's property could have. I mean, all Snake Hill could be littered with. I mean, if in fact my uncle had the financial fortunes of the current of the Davises, that things would have been fine. Because my uncle. Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, my uncle was not a particularly astute businessman, but his heart was absolutely in the right place, and he was doing his duty for the he and his friends were going to save a significant portion of Garrison from the kind of development that they didn't want to see.
Which, John Adams has spent years and years, with the Institute.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's fabulous.
It is. This town's been very, very lucky to have some people who really stand up and get counted. And we're really fortunate. I mean, I think we're really fortunate to have John Adams here and Gil Burke here and Chris and Sharon Davis move into town and take a real interest and be really civic-minded the way they are. We're very fortunate. And the town government, for all its, they're just Cold Spring guys. They're just Cold Spring men and women. They have a wonderful sense of town and preservation and have kept a very good dialogue with the people around who can help them with various things. And the fact that the governor lives here is probably, in many cases can be a benefit too. He likes to keep things open.
He likes to have his electricity on.
Yeah, he does, and it was wonderful. Those are the days when we were, before the Patakis came to live there, it was the Benjamin family house, and we were there all the time. I mean, it was, again, if you think of this group of we were at the Highlands Country Club, we were at our house, or we were at the Benjamins, or maybe at Polly's house. And these were wonderful houses that where, you know, and the Benjamins and now Pataki's had the first swimming pool. I believe they had the first swimming pool in town. So we'd swim over. It was a really nice, I mean, the 50s and 60s in the summer was, and on vacation, it was a wonderful place to live.
Was Dick Durham involved in your, no, he would have been older, right?
He would have, but I think he was in Uncle Sandy's group to put this Northward Out Club together. There's a whole nother history for you. The Durham family is, I mean, every bit as interesting as the Osborns, maybe more so.
I know.
And you know,
we lived, you know, we were in the coach house that was part of that estate for many. That's when we first came to.
And Emily lives across.
Yeah,
that's right. And I mean, the Osborns are newcomers to town versus the Durhams.
Oh yeah, because they came in, 1839.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
So it wasn't too much, you know.
No, but it's.
Jump or whatever.
No, that's a great story.
Yeah, and I know they were one of the 400. The family, the Durham family. They were in shipping.
Were they? I couldn't tell you about. Yeah.
Well, I love going to the Aldrich where he said, you know, their land patent was 1633, but he said, of course, we haven't occupied the land all of that time.
We've got to let.
Yeah, I think. Thank you. That was really fun. I'm sorry. There are moments when I get a little choked up because I sort of think about the history.
History.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
It's your memories. And,
Any of them.
yeah. Well, I wasn't hunting for bad memories. I just.
And I know.
Maybe it
No.
was a little. And you're doing it. Okay.
Okay, we're rolling.
My name is Sonia Gilligan. I just interviewed Nat Prentice on September 20th, 2005.
Okay, why don't you do it again?
Okay. My name is Sonia Gilligan. I live in Garrison. I just interviewed Nat Prentice on September 20th, 2005.
Okay. We're rolling.
Could you tell us your name, please?
Okay. My name is Polly Townsend. Actually, I was named Mary Cleland Townsend after her grandmother, who also never used the name Mary. And I have never used the name Mary. It's always been, Polly's my nickname, and I've been Polly for 56 years. But my real name is Mary, and most people don't even know that, but I have to write checks with that, and so.
How did you get the nickname Polly?
It actually is an English nickname. In England, Polly is a nickname for Mary. I think it comes from Molly. And if you think about it, it has about as much in common as Dick and Richard. You know, it's just used to that. And my mother had a doll, a large paper doll, whose name was Polly. And so she had fallen in love with that name, Polly. So she wanted to name, my father wanted to name me Rebecca Priscilla. And she said, over my dead body, no. What about Mary after my mother, and oddly enough, my grandmother, whose first name was Mary, Mary Frances Coogee, never used the name Mary either. So, continuing that tradition. But.
When and where were you born?
Okay, I was born in February of 1949 at Butterfield Hospital in Cold Spring.
Could you tell us a little bit about your early life, your parents?
Okay. I'll start with my father. My father was born in 1893 in Boston, and I didn't get that wrong. It really was 1893. And very early on, from a Boston family, and when he was very young, I believe he was about 11 or 12, he was sent to boarding school at Storm King School. And I believe that's where, you know, my father obviously was very old when I was born, so he had a lot of life that before I ever came on the scene. And so there are a lot of things that I didn't ask because he died when I was 14. So a lot of it is, I've found the letters that he wrote to his parents from Storm King Mountain. That's how I know that he went to Storm King School. He never mentioned it. Well, it isn't necessarily something you talk about where you went to pre-boarding school with your child. So, but he went to Storm King School, and I believe that's when he fell in love with the Hudson River. He then went to St. George's, and then he went to Harvard, and then he lived, he was in the First World War. He was in the Navy, and he lived in England. He was posted in England, and somehow when he came back, he started living in New York. First, New York City. He married a woman named Daisy and had my half-sister, whose name is Wendy. My father's name is Wendell Townsend, and she was Catherine Wendell Townsend, so known as Wendy. See, nobody uses their first name in my family. And about 3 years later, they were divorced, and my father moved to Rye, and his ex-wife moved to Bronxville. And that was kind of their connection. He grew up with a love of sailing. They went to, from Boston, they went to Cohasset every summer, and they sailed. So sailing was very important to him. So I believe he moved to Rye because of the American Yacht Club, which was in Rye, and he kept his sailboats there. He also loved cars. He loved machines of any kind. He was actually a machinist in the Navy, and I don't know where he learned it because I don't think they teach it in Harvard Business School, but somehow he got this love of machines. And so he had cars very early. So in these early days, he would take trips, and he would invite friends, couples, and also women that, in groups, so it was kind of legitimate, and go on skiing trips. And on one of these skiing trips, this is a long way around how we get to my parents' meeting. On one of these skiing trips, he went to a place called Jug and Barn, which is up in, I think it's in the corner of Massachusetts, right near New York, where those three states come together. And the man who ran the place was a man named Wendell Stevenson, another Wendell. Wendell Stevenson and his wife, Ellie. They had converted what was, I think, a barn into a ski lodge. And so my father was there with a group of friends. And Pappy, Wen Stevenson, later in life, he was a good friend of ours, later was always known as Pappy. So I will probably call him Pappy because, no first names. Pappy was the cook one morning, and my father always started out the day with oatmeal. He had always had a full breakfast, and it started with oatmeal. And Pappy that morning had forgotten to start the oatmeal. There was no such thing as instant oatmeal. It took 15 minutes to a half an hour to make oatmeal. And the guy came in and said, this guy wants oatmeal. So so he started making the oatmeal and, was giving him other things and figured, we'll just keep feeding him and maybe he'll forget about the oatmeal. And finally they said, no, he really wants his oatmeal. So Pappy dished out the oatmeal and sent it out and thought, well, maybe he won't notice it's not really cooked. And after breakfast, my father came in and said, who made that oatmeal? And Pappy started to say, I know, listen, I'm sorry. He said, that's the best oatmeal I ever ate in my life. And that was the beginning of their friendship. They got to be very good friends. And Pappy and Ellie bought a house in New Hampshire. They decided they were going to do their own ski lodge. So they moved to Rumney, New Hampshire, on this long dirt road called the East Rumney Road. They had a place called Four Winds. And my father just moved with them and went and took ski trips to Four Winds from then on, and decided that he loved it so much he wanted to stay there more often. And right on the same road there was a big house for sale, so he bought a summer house right on that road. And he and Wendy, my sister, would go on vacations with them. She had, and one summer he was there, and Pappy was there, and a woman who was visiting someone was there, and it happened to be my mother. And she was in a sailboat, because my mother also grew up on sailboats. And my father turned to Pappy and said, "That's the most beautiful woman I ever saw. What is her name? You have to introduce me, because I'm going to marry her." And 4 years later, he did. So that's how my parents met. And they lived when they were married, they lived in Rye. My mother had grown up in Manhasset on Long Island. And she and her two sisters sailed constantly. They were right on the water, and they each had their own sailboat, and that's what they did. Every spring they'd, strip it down and repaint it, and they had sailboat races. And so that was a big part of their life. So they lived in Rye when my brother was born in 1945, and continued to enjoy the American Yacht Club. And my mother's sister, Virginia Bassett, when she was married, Virginia Shoemaker and then Virginia Bassett, must have had a friend who lived in Garrison, and they came to visit. This is Virginia and George came to visit. And they said, "Oh, Wendell and Barbie, you have to come up here. You have to come see this town, Garrison. I think you'll really like it." And that was how my parents came up here. My father saw this place for sale it was either called Wintergreen Farm, or before that it was the Mountain Home, and it had 80 acres. And it was listed for a great deal of money. At the time, it was listed for $100,000, which was astronomical in 1948. Marguerite Rogers owned it. She sat down with my father, who was one of the most charming men of all time, and she reduced the price to what he could pay, because she wanted someone who loved it as much as she did. And she found somebody who loved it as much as he loved. He'd always been very interested in organic farming. I don't know where this came from. I mean, nobody even knew that we were using chemicals in those days, but he evidently knew about it, and he thought, no. I found pamphlets about organic farming, and he loved to farm, I think principally because you could use machines. You could justify the purchase of tractors and gravelies and plows, and he had them all. The house was very big, and it had a separate barn and a garage and an ice house and a tool house and 2 chicken houses, and it was an estate. And so he could justify all of those things. He had a business in New York City. It was called Hilker Townsend. They imported typewriter, the material that typewriter ribbon was made out of, and sold it to companies that used typewriter ribbon. But he started, it was his own company, and he early on said, I don't do any business after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so I'm just going to leave. So he would take a train back. He left very early in the morning and came back, and he'd spend the rest of the day puttering around, on the gravely, cutting grass, and, with 80 acres, and we didn't have anybody that helped us. So there was always a lot to do. But he loved that part of it. And that's where I was very lucky enough to be born in 1949.
Did he keep farm animals, and did he actually farm certain crops?
We had crops. We had a huge garden. We had enough strawberries on our strawberry patch so that he would call people up and say, "Come pick," and equally a raspberry patch and asparagus. We had a very large garden, which was already there, and he just maintained it. There was between the house and the vegetable garden, there was a rose garden path, and then off to the side of that was a hedge garden, a formal, very English-looking hedge garden. There was a full greenhouse, very large, that he used as long as he could. The farm animals we had ducks for a while, and I think my father decided he didn't really love having ducks, and then nobody wanted to eat the eggs anyway, so what was the point of having ducks? And then we tried sheep, and we had sheep, a number of generations of sheep, but they were some local dogs that came and killed the babies all the time. This just happened, I don't know, 3 or 4 times, 3 or 4 springs when we had babies. And he knew who it was and argued with them and told them, you have to keep your dogs in or I'll shoot them. Well, my father would never have shot any animal, so, they probably knew it was a blind threat. So we finally gave up on the sheep. And just about that time, when I was turning 11, he finally gave in to my pleas to get a horse. So from then on, the main animals we had were my horse, and I had one and then another horse. But that was one of my passions early on, was having a horse, and I took riding lessons from probably when I was 7 or 8, started riding at a local place. There was a place in Shrub Oak called Meadowmar, and you spent the day there. You went in the morning and you did everything that you needed to do to the horse, tacked up, cleaned, rode, and then came in and had a formal lunch with this couple. And then you had rest periods, where we'd learn to play jacks, and then go out and do the same thing all over again, tack up the horse and clean it. And so you spent from like 9 to 5. It was a great way to learn how to take care of a horse because you did everything. But they didn't do it any longer. I only did that for a little, I think 1 summer. And then I took classes at Sunnyfield, which is the riding stable in Bedford Hills that was available. And then finally got my own horse when I was 11, and from then on, it was just my horse and myself, trotting all over the community. Garrison is spread out enough so that there were no neighbors. In fact, at one point, I think my mother decided she couldn't stand driving both of us everywhere, and so my father decided to sell some land to a couple, that a little square of the land, and as long as they had kids, and they had a boy and a girl. They weren't exactly the right ages, but he figured it was close enough, and so that's why that house is there, because my father was tired of it. And that problem got solved when I had a horse, because I would ride to my friend's house. There was the Sieber family they lived on Old West Point Road, and we lived on Snake Hill Road. But they're just woods between those 2 parts. You can go all over. My father bought the horse from Mr. Gill, who was William Osborne's, the one that lived at Forest Farm, his groom. He still had horses. I think he was too old to ride, but he loved the idea of having horses. So Mr. Gill took care of his horses. And I would, before a show, I would ride my pony over to Mr. Gill's, and because there was a show in Garrison once. They actually had horse shows right at the bottom, the field across the way. And he would do my horse's mane up in rosettes, so, little braids, and then green rosettes that matched my coat. So horses were a big part of my life growing up.
Who did you ride to see? What other they weren't
Okay.
really neighbors.
Right. Well, Kathy Jo Sieber had a Palomino, and she lived on Old West Point Road. Another, Jan Kenny had a horse, a buckskin, but she kept it at the Pattersons off of 9D. So we would ride in that direction towards Cold Spring. Leona Dushin had the Pony Club at the time, so there were meets at her house, and so we would ride Old West Point Road across to Graymore and go up and down Graymore and come across to, I think it's Diamond Hill Road, and go back in there and get to the Dushins. There was a family named Rogers. Bob and Rita Rogers had 2 horses on Old Albany Post Road, and it was very easy to get to Old Albany Post Road. We kind of knew the back ways. We made trails if there wasn't one. to not ride. I mean, sometimes you had to ride on the road, but the road wasn't anywhere near as busy as it is now. I can remember at the top of the hill on Route 9, there was a gas station known as Frattoni's. He ran it for many, many, many years, and it had, you know, candy and the kind of things that convenience stores have. And one day, Kathy Jo and I decided we needed a candy bar or something, and we tied our horses up there and got whatever it was. And our horses, one of them had left some manure on Ronnie Bertoni's pavement. He was not thrilled with that, despite the fact that he was a gardener. And we said, now listen, that's, you know, that's gold, that's Garrison gold, you know, just save it and put it on your garden. But he just didn't want to hear about it. Didn't want it was the one hazard of trying to ride to the store with your horse.
What other leisure time activities did you?
Leisure time activities. Well, I skated in the winter. Earl's Pond was one place where everybody went to skate, but so was
Where is Earl's?
Earl's Pond. It's on Old Albany. No, not on Old Albany. It's now called South Highland. If you take Old Albany Post Road and turn onto that, it used to be called something else, but now it's called South Highland. So it's back by the Fish and Game Club, and there's a really nice pond that freezes very early, and everybody not only skated at Earl's, but and the Fish and Game Club did not. There was no building there, so there was no building to have warm, you know, hot cocoa. People would just build a fire and have little impromptu picnics outside. And the other place we skated all the time was at the country club, Highlands Country Club, and I don't think nobody paid any attention, so I don't think it made any difference whether you were a member of the country club. It was just there, and it froze, and everybody skated there, and so did the Capuchins. The Capuchin monks used to skate there all the time, and they were very good about teaching you to skate, because they were very good, and if you were just learning, they would, you know, help you out. So that was one activity. Skiing while we're on winter. My father was a big skier. That's, you know, sort of how this whole thing started. And he built a ski tow on the side of our mountain. The 80 acres was, I don't know, maybe about 25 acres cleared fields. And then as it went up to the mountains, the South Redoubt is behind it, but that's all woods. And he decided it would be great to build a ski tow. So we got a long rope, and one of the tractors that we had lots of, drove up to the top, and you kind of put it on blocks, I guess, so it doesn't move anywhere, but the top